I'm Dr. Shubhangi Vaidya from the School of Interdisciplinary and Transdisciplinary Studies. This session pertains to the unit number 2 of the course MGP 003, in which we are going to discuss a critique of the Indian social order. What we are going to try and do in this lecture is to understand the concept of social order and discuss the nature of the social order in India. And thereafter, we will discuss and analyze the Gandhian critique of the Indian social order. So let's begin by addressing the first question. What do we mean by social order? So when you think about societies, which are basically a collection of all kinds of individuals and collectivities, the fundamental question that social scientists ask is, what makes societies cohere? What makes them stay together? So social order basically refers to a set of linked social structures, institutions, and practices which conserve, maintain, and enforce normal ways of relating and behaving. So basically, in simple words, in any kind of a society, you will find that there are certain ways in which human beings interact with each other. There are certain ways of doing things. There are certain systems of values, norms, beliefs, and so on, which by and large most individuals hold or have a consensus on. And it is because of this that the society is able to hang together, that the society is able to stick together, and people are able to live in harmony with each other. So, a social order is a relatively stable system of institutions, of patterns of interactions and customs, which is capable of continually reproducing at least those conditions essential for its own existence. So societies carry on from one generation to the next. Of course, changes take place, but by and large, the order, the social order, remains intact, which is why societies survive. The concept of social order refers to all those facts of society which remain relatively constant over time. This includes, for instance, relationships of property, exchange and power relations, cultural forms, communication, relations between individuals, ideologies, values, etc. And some of the major principles of social order that we can identify are the principle of dependence, wherein individuals are dependent upon society for their sustenance, the principle of visibility, and the principle of extensiveness. So basically, social order refers to a situation in which individuals are enmeshed within the ideological, the cultural, the social, the economic systems of society. And there is a mutual interdependence between individuals which enables them to continue to live in society. What are some of the dimensions of social order? So social order comprises of social groups and social networks. The primary social group that we can think about is the family. And when the family extends, there are more and more networks that we call the kinship network. We have the neighborhoods, we have professional associations, caste groups, religious communities, etc., which are basically collections of individuals which are bound together by certain shared values, ties, interests, and so on. So social order basically comprises of a whole network of groups and institutions which are bound together by various kinds of mutual interrelationships. Of course, a very, very important dimension is power relationships. So in any group or in any kind of a network, you will find some individuals or some collectives which are more powerful, and they are able to maintain some kind of dominance or control over the others. Norms, values, and social mores, which are ways of orienting and prescribing socially sanctioned behavior, are also very, very important aspects of social order. And like I mentioned, power, authority, and enforcement of these norms, in case of behavior which goes against these norms, or what we call deviant behavior, is usually enforced, and inevitably we find that it is the more powerful sections of society which prevail over the less powerful. And of course, because of this dimension of power and authority and unequal kind of distribution of power and prestige, we find that the possibility of social tensions and strife also exists within society. So there are many important perspectives on social order, and the most important ones that social scientists basically look at are perspectives which foreground consensus. In other words, there are social scientists who believe that social order is maintained through a social consensus. That is, the shared norms, values, and moral beliefs that individuals hold in common enables them to stay together, enables society to hang together. There is also the contradictory view or the conflict view, which looks at social order and social change in terms of a balance of power between competing groups, in terms of material and political domination that certain groups exercise. So broadly, we can speak of the functionalist view of social order and the conflict or the Marxist view of social order. Now, if we think in terms of the Gandhian perspective, Gandhi basically emphasized consensus and shared values. And he really upheld the unity of human life, which could not really be compartmentalized. So if we think in terms of, the social system, the economic system, the human personality as all being separate, this really is not a very, Gandhian way of looking at the social order. Gandhi basically foregrounded the unity of human life, foregrounded that human life and social life, there is an intimate interconnection between the two of them. So let's talk now about the Gandhian perspective on social order and social change. If one has to alter a particular social order, it is necessary to try to change the important segments of society, namely the cultural system, the social system, as well as the personality system. So it is a change in all these dimensions that can ultimately lead to a more lasting change in the social order. And without approaching these simultaneously, it will not be possible to alter the socio-cultural order in a creative fashion. Now, Gandhi wanted not only freedom for all. So we primarily know Gandhi as the father or the architect of India's freedom. But for him, this freedom was not merely a political freedom. It was also a transformation of the entire social order of the country. Political independence was only a part of his larger objectives, which were basically social and human transformation. Let's talk now about Gandhian thoughts on the ideal functioning of a society. Firstly, the acceptance of ahimsa as an end and as a means in all individual and social actions is crucial. Acceptance of egalitarian values in social, economic, and political institutions, which repudiate or reject all bases of inequalities. So even if these inequalities are religiously sanctioned, they have to be denied because egalitarianism is at the very fulcrum of a non-violent society. Belief in God, Gandhi was deeply religious and deeply spiritual. However, this belief was tempered with, or this belief was also very, very implicit with a toleration or an acceptance of different religious faiths. Continuous reformation of the individual in terms of moral values of non-violence, as we've earlier mentioned, Gandhi placed a huge premium on non-violence, and fearless and selfless action in the pursuit of truth and non-violence, identifying one's own happiness with that of the entire society. So here once again we see that the individual and the collective are not distinct entities. The individual and the collective are combined through ethical action, through non-violent means and ends, which will then lead to the ideal society. Let's talk a little bit about Gandhi's attempts to alter the social order. So repudiation of untouchability or rejection of untouchability is a very, very important value that he espoused throughout his life. we see that the caste order, which is one of the fundamental organizing principles of Indian society, is inherently hierarchical. There is a system of hierarchy which is birth-based, and we find that those communities or those groups which are at the bottom of the social pyramid suffer from utmost dehumanization. The practice of untouchability, therefore, is violence. And oppression of any form that is enacted by one human being on the other, is an act of violence. And the liberation of the oppressed groups is a non-violent activity, provided that the means that are employed are ethical. Gandhi was also interested in economic institutions. So apart from the cultural institution or the social institution of caste, he was also interested in reforming or transforming economic institutions. And so his concepts like aparigraha, which is basically non-possession, non-hoarding. So a society which is based not on wanting to grasp or hoard material goods. The notion of Daridra Narayan, which is a very, very important notion, that is the service or seva to the poorest, to the most humble, to the most needy individual. Trusteeship, Swadeshi, decentralization, the dignity of labor, and above all his idea of the spinning wheel economy. Because as we know, Gandhi believed that India is a land of villages, and it is in the rural economy and through the rural economy that India's progress can take place. So his economic ideas are also extremely rooted in the realities, in the lived realities of his people. He preferred an economy in which everyone would work and earn their daily bread. So dignity of labor is also a very, very crucial dimension of the Gandhian scheme of things. And keep in mind that caste, which is the social institution, is also linked with work, wherein certain kinds of work as per the traditional caste hierarchy are considered superior and some are considered degraded forms of work. So through this kind of emphasis on dignity of labor, Gandhi challenged the notion that there are certain kinds of work which are degrading or polluting or inferior to other kinds of work. So this notion of dignity of labor, everybody working and earning their daily bread by the sweat of their own brow, are very, very important aspects or facets of his integration of a change in culture with a change in economy. Also, if capitalist and large-scale production was inevitable, he would allow it, provided that the accumulation of wealth was done by non-violent means and for the sake of the poor. So the poor, the poorest person, the most powerless person was really at the heart, was at the core of Gandhi's entire notion of transforming or altering the social order. Gandhi also tried to introduce more egalitarian values in the institutions of caste and economy and property, as we've just discussed. Because if we look at caste and class, we find that actually it is the lowest classes which are actually the most poor and the most deprived. And therefore, in order to ensure that the poorest and the most deprived get their due, a radical transformation of the social structure would be required. Gandhi also placed a great deal of emphasis on the alteration of political institutions. Now, as we know, as the architect of India's non-violent freedom struggle, his insistence on satyagraha and non-violent resistance in political actions and peaceful resolution of conflicts, the whole struggle for Swaraj, his preference for democracy, adult franchise, decentralization of power and so on, had a deep impact on Indian society and a deep impact on the social order as such. So we see that his political and his social goals were allied. So he did not want freedom at the cost of violence. Gandhi wanted a non-violent freedom struggle. He promoted non-violence and he promoted social transformation along with an overthrow of the colonial system. Let's discuss Gandhi's perspective on religion and the social order. Now, as we know, he was deeply steeped in his faith, which was basically the Hindu faith, and Hindu religious values were very, very key in his worldview. He has been critiqued for bringing in very strongly loaded Hindu values, for instance, the whole notion of Ramarajya, into his political and social thinking. However, at the same time, we find that he had immense regard for the values and teachings of other faiths, and he firmly believed in religious tolerance. In fact, when we see that the entire history of divide and rule and communal polarization, which took place as an unfortunate consequence of British rule, which finally led to partition, these were deeply painful events for him. This was something which pained him deeply, and his attempts to restore communal harmony, which are well known by all of us. So his attempts to bring together persons of all faith were a lasting contribution to the freedom struggle, as well as a lasting contribution to Indian society as such. A very important dimension that needs to be discussed is Gandhi's stress or emphasis on individual reformation. So while we talk about social reformation, we cannot exclusively talk about transforming the culture or transforming the economy or transforming values. Individual reformation is also very, very crucial. And his insistence on character formation and the scheme of basic education aim to take care of the child's values right from the very beginning. Informal education within the home, therefore, is critical. And here we find Gandhi places a great deal of emphasis on the role of the women in the home, who play a very, very major role in imparting values to their children. In India, women were oppressed, and however, without raising their status, no worthwhile social change could take place. So this is a very, very important insight, that unless women, who are basically the agents of character formation, of imparting values, of imparting ideals to the growing child, if they themselves are in a state of oppression, if they are not emancipated, then social change really cannot take place. Gandhi also insisted on certain very, very key ethical values or certain kinds of moral characteristics or behavior. For instance, he laid a great deal of emphasis on celibacy or brahmacharya, non-stealing, telling the truth, observing non-violence, etc. And all these practices and all these beliefs were meant to reinforce the transformation of human character. In other words, the individual personality was to be molded in such a way so as to become conducive for accepting egalitarian values. So basically, the individual was considered to be a very, very key agent in basically facilitating or being at the very forefront of social, political, economic, and cultural transformation. Let's talk a bit about Gandhi's views on science, technology, and spirituality. And there is a great deal of discussion and debate on how Gandhi basically opposed large-scale industrialization, urbanization, and thoughtless use of modern technology. This was because he believed that this would inflict violence both on humans and on nature. The Gandhian view on development, the Gandhian view on the village as being the fulcrum of development, on his resistance to large-scale industrial development, his belief that it was large-scale industrial development and colonialism, the whole enterprise of plundering of both of nature as well as of civilizations that were dominated by those who wielded power. This, according to him, was the very heart of the colonial and exploitative and violent kind of economic and social system that was there all around us. And therefore, his emphasis was on taking the focus to the village, labor-intensive technologies, and therefore his views on science, technology, industrialization, and so on do come into conflict with views that emphasize economic growth, that emphasize economic development, and large-scale ways of doing so. Although, like I've mentioned, his views were challenged by many, we find that they have a good deal of relevance in the light of the persistence and the intensification of huge economic and social inequalities that we see all around us to this day. Regarding his views on spirituality, on religion, on God, etc., these are really not amenable to social scientific analysis, because ultimately these are certain values which cannot really be put to the test. However, it is very important that the important takeaway is that his insistence on cultivation of values of truth, non-violence, ethical means, and respect for integrity of life in all its forms. We find that these values basically are the very foundation of a humane society. So even though we really cannot discuss very much about his views, his personal views on God, sometimes he thought that he heard the voice of God which guided his action and so on. So these are not really things which are amenable for a social scientific analysis. However, what is important to bear in mind is that his value system, which respected all forms of life, are very, very crucial and very, very relevant in the present context as well. To conclude, I think we can say that Gandhian perspectives on social order and social change bring together the individual and the societal or the collective in a harmonious fusion. And Gandhi approached the social order from different angles at the same time. He wanted to transform the cultural, the social, and the personality systems simultaneously to lay the foundations of the new India of his dreams. Thank you.